Hi, Pastor Dusty here. We're going to be spending some time walking through the Word in Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Each week, we like to spend time examining God's Word and seeing what we can learn from it, how we can obey it, and how it really shapes the follower of Jesus' life and stuff. And so we're going to spend time, again, looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 8, and we're going to go through the whole chapter for this teaching. And so, one of the important things to remember as we're looking at God's Word is context is really important. And we talk about the arrow and the fletchings, the back part of the arrow, where does this fit in God's story? And you got the shaft part of the arrow um, that really kind of holds it all together. And we talk about interpretation and stuff. And then the tip of the arrow of where it applies to our hearts and how we can learn from it and stuff. And so we're going to be looking in here. And again, Ecclesiastes is wisdom literature. And and a lot of the questions that have been asked in this book, is apparently by Solomon, and he's kind of looking at things of like, why does the world work the way it does? And everything seems to be vanity in some ways. In some ways, hevel is what the Jewish word for that is. It's like this wind that we can't quite grasp on and stuff. And in the previous section, we're going to look at chapter 8. In the previous section, it talks about how wisdom is great. Wisdom, generally speaking, will make your life better. Generally speaking, it will help you do what you need to do. Generally speaking, it will go well for you if you're a wise person. However, even wisdom has its limitations, right? And this is written with the idea that this is King Solomon, who is the wisest person who ever lived. And he's kind of looking back and acknowledging, like, well, I was wise, but even wisdom had its limitations. And he said, I tried all these different things. I tried to pursue all these different pursuits that the world has to offer, and those couldn't, those couldn't satisfy. And even wisdom, which I thought wouldn't. Okay, and so we get in here, understanding with this context that wisdom has its limitations. And so he asks this question in chapter 8. It says, who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. And he keeps going back and saying, wisdom, does have its place. Like, it really, really does. And in here, he even gives the expression, a man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. Because when we just look around the world, there are a lot of frustrating things. Okay, one, we see things like injustice all around us. We can't escape it. We see things like sickness all around us, right in our faces. Can't escape it. And all these things that we see, if we didn't have the wisdom, then it'd be a really frustrating thing. It says, but if we have wisdom, it says even our countenance, our face will be changed, right? Because we're going to have the ability to understand things and see how the world works and understand, really the most important part is we understand where God is, and then how we fit into that equation. And those are really crucial things. And a lot of people live really frustrated lives because they can't make that connection. But we're gonna see he's gonna give some examples of some just ideas, because he'll show us some examples of some of those frustrating places. So he moves on. Verse 2, it says, I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Okay, and we're actually going to have this little section about politics, right? And the couple things you're supposed to avoid, right, is religion and politics. And we're going to deep dive into these in this teaching and stuff. And the author is going to give us some advice, some wisdom in here on how to see that and stuff. And so anyway, let's take a look at it. Verse 2, I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him, right? And it gives us this picture. Now they would have believed, this ancient culture would have believed that um, that the king was divinely placed in charge of things. Okay, and actually that's not too far off, because even though we don't have kings, at least in our country, the Bible is clear that says God is sovereignly doing things in the world, right? Like there's an element where the people who are put in charge, um, Like it didn't take God by surprise, right? He didn't get shocked. Okay, we just had recently had a presidential election. Some people are happy, some people are mad of who won, but it didn't surprise God. God knew what was going to happen. It didn't surprise him, right? And so in his wisdom, this author is saying, hey, you know, in general, we are supposed to obey and keep the commands of the government, right? That's a good idea because God isn't surprised at that, and God working out his huge plan of redemption. Remember, God has this plan of redemption, right? You got the biblical story of God created humans. These humans fell and turned away from God, and then God is working out the story of how to redeem them. And so, at part of that story is he came and left the joys of heaven and came down to earth, and in as Jesus, the incarnate God, and lived the perfect life. And he's working out this plan to redeem us and make it an option for us as humans to be made right with God. Okay, and so it's kind of having this whole plan in here, and so somehow God is working the rulers of the world, um, leaders of countries, in working out His plan. Right? I don't understand how that all works, but the Bible is very clear that this is what is happening. So He says, keep the king's command, okay, because there's this God element here, right? Because of God's oath to Him, okay, and there might be some cultural things in there as well. Verse 3. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Right? And so it gives this picture that it uses the example of a king. Like I said, we don't have a king, and so sometimes we just kind of gloss over these things. But I think what he's saying is, hey, don't get into something that you can't change. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't, stand against injustice and stuff like that. But he says, hey, take some wisdom and tact in understanding what's going on here. Okay, there's a time for everything, right? As it said earlier in Ecclesiastes 3. And so wisdom says, hey, you got to understand sometimes when to speak up and sometimes when to be quiet, because the authorities, they get to have some control on certain things that you might not be able to change. And so don't try to fight at times when you can't change, because it's not going to do anything. It's just going to get you in trouble. Right? So do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the Lord is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Okay, verse 5. Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything. Right? So he's not saying, well, just roll over and don't ever speak up towards injustice. Don't ever try to defend someone. Right? He's saying, be careful and make sure if you do it, you're doing it with the right timing. You're doing it with the right understanding. There's certain protocols for you to go through, certain hoops you need to be jumping through, right? And we see that with our government, our country, and other places as well. Is there's certain ways to go about certain things, and we need to understand when the proper time is and what even the proper case is for that to happen. And we've seen some really amazing things. I'll give you an example of Abraham Lincoln and getting rid of slavery in our country. And this was a great thing that happened in the mid 1800s, and they went at the proper time in the right way, and there was a big cost involved in that and stuff, but they went about it the right, the way in which it was able to get done. There was a time for it. There was a proper time. Okay, and there's a way. Continuing verse 6, although man's trouble lies heavy on him, for he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? Right? So there's this limitation that we as humans have, is that we don't know the future. Right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know how it's going to go about. We don't know what's going to happen. And so it's a big limitation for us. So it's a huge limitation as we're looking at injustices, as we're looking at how do we balance what it looks like to follow Jesus and live in a place that has rules, right? And sometimes these rules contradict. Sometimes the laws of our land go against the rules and God's law, right? And so ultimately we have to follow God's law, um, and stuff. But there's, so there's this tension, there's this dynamic here. Okay, add on to that, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and there's just a lot of difficulties then in this whole situation, right? And we see people really frustrated often with governments, and laws of the land, and how to switch and get those, and how to go through the proper channels, and stuff like that. And we're seeing kind of this fleshed out, right? And this was written, roughly 2,500 years ago, okay, give or take a little bit, in that ballpark, right? So this has been around for thousands of years, as long as there's been civilization, and there's been leadership, and there's been rules, and there's been laws, and there's been governing, right? This has just been a thing that's been happening. Verse 8, so no man has power to retain the spirit, or power over the day of death. There's no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. Right? So he's saying, well, you can't just fight evil with evil. You can't just fight wickedness with wickedness. You can't just be like, oh, well, let's just start a war all the time. We'll just take it and make it a fight. He's saying, that's not always going to be the option. That's not always going to be the best thing, right? Maybe there's circumstances in which that will be, one of the better things and stuff. But typically, wickedness is not going to defeat wickedness. Verse 9, all this I observed while applying my heart to all that is under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. Right? So he said, I've been observing this. I've been watching this. And he would have observed lots of different wars. He would have observed lots of different ways. King Solomon lived in mostly a time of peace and stuff, but they still had their challenges and stuff. And so here's what he says. Continue, verse 10. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place, and were praised in the city where they had done such things. And so he's kind of going to start making these observations where he's like, okay, here's some of the things I believe, but here's some of the things I have seen, and sometimes it doesn't add up. Sometimes it doesn't work like it's supposed to. Right? So I'm seeing these wicked people buried, and they were, they bad people, and then somehow they're praised in these places where they did these bad things, and you're just kind of scratching your head, be like, what is going on here? Right? This is also vanity. Verse 11, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of children of man is fully set to do evil. Right? So there's this observation about, man, there is just an underlying wickedness that lies in the hearts of people that we can't escape, right? And the Bible talks lots about this idea of sin, and it being passed on from generation to generation. No one escapes it. All are participants in it. And because of that, things don't work like they're supposed to. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. Right? So he's kind of getting with this conviction now. Right? Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before the Lord. Okay, so this is something he just knows to be true. He doesn't always see it work itself out like this, but he knows, like, ultimately, like, the wicked have to get what's coming to them, right? Because of who God is, right? God is a God of justice. God is a good God. And so it just makes sense then, man, the people who do wrong, they're going to get what's coming to them. But he says, man, I sometimes just don't see it, right? The evidence doesn't always point to that, because sometimes wicked people and bad people, they get a seemingly good life, and good people, honest people, sometimes live in poverty and difficult lives, and endure sickness and endure all this kind of stuff. Verse 14, there's a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. He's like, the evidence just doesn't add up sometimes, because the wrong people are getting what's coming to them. That's what he's seeing, right? That's what he just looks at the world and says, man, I'm just seeing this, observing. I know it's not true. I know the truth is that those who do what's right, those who follow God, it's going to be better for them than those who are wicked, right? I know that's true. Yet, when I just look around in the world, right, and this is some of the limitation of wisdom, because when I actually look, it doesn't make sense to me. And I think we can feel that sometimes. And there's some responses that we can have to this, because sometimes what we do is we like to blame something for this injustice, right? Because it doesn't add up. Okay, so a lot of people will then blame, for example, their government, be like, oh, it's the government's fault because they're corrupt. Okay, that has some validity to it, right? Because government should be corrupt, but we see it all the time, and it's not just our government; it's governments everywhere. Whether we're in a democracy, whether it's a socialist government, okay, whether it's a dictator, whether it's fat, like they all participate in it. I'm a little bit partial to ours being, maybe kind of eliminating some of these things, but eventually, even in the best human made system we can come up with, it still has its limitations, right? There's a vanity that takes place on earth. Righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. And there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of righteous. It doesn't add up. I said that this is also vanity. Verse 15. And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat, drink, and be joyful. For this will go with him and his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. Right? So all we can kind of come up with in here is like, okay, here's just what we can control then. Here's just what we can do. I like how it says in the New Living in the middle column here. So I recommend, right? So I'm seeing all this stuff. There is an injustice. We can't fix it. It's part of this world system that we're in. Nothing fixes it. So I like how it says in NLT. So I recommend. Here's my recommendation. I recommend having fun, because there's nothing better for people in this world than to eat, drink, and enjoy life, that they will experience some happiness along with all the hard work God gives them under the sun. Right? And so I don't think he's just saying, well, pursue happiness at all costs or pursue pleasure at all costs. Because remember earlier, different chapters in the book of Ecclesiastes, he said he actually tried to do that. Right? If it's just seeking out pleasure, if it's just seeking that out, that's not going to quite do it either. But part of it is true. Part of it is like, hey, let's just enjoy what we have. Okay, some of the stuff we just can't fix. And so there's no point in constantly just being angry all the time. Right? We can't just be angry and upset at the world all the time, where it ruins our life. Oh, it's always going to be bad. It's always this. Okay, there's a truth in that. And so there's wisdom then in accepting, hey, this is the reality of our world. And so here's some of the things I can control: is I can go to work, is I can eat, drink, I can enjoy my family, I can enjoy the things that this world does offer. And I can do that. So I can live a decent life with what I have. He goes on. Verse 16, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the busyness that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. Okay, I'll read in the NLT. In my search for wisdom and my observation of people's burdens here on earth, I discovered that there is ceaseless activity day and night. Right? People are always doing stuff ceaselessly, trying to do stuff, trying to do this, trying to do that. And verse 17, I realized that no one can discover everything God is doing under the sun. I discovered that there are limits to my understanding of who God is. And he continues and says, not even the wisest people discover everything, no matter what they claim. Right? If someone says they have it all figured out, you can be like, okay, that's just not true. Okay, they can claim it, that they have everything figured out. But because we're humans, there are limitations to that. And so we see the author here of observing and really wrestling. Okay, a lot of people are wrestling with their faith these days, right? Because they see some of the positions, and they look at the how the church and some of the things that the so-called church does, um, and it can be frustrating sometimes. They can see people who say, "Hey, no, we're people who follow Jesus," but then their actions don't really look it, and it can be really a downer. It can really confusing. Like, oh man, I thought we were supposed to be a certain way, and we see how there's a mix sometimes between politics and religion and science and all these different different angles of looking at stuff, and it can be really confusing because we look at our world and we live in a world that is just difficult and broken. We look at a world that is just it's just messed up, and through all of our efforts, even with the best intentions, we can't do anything about it. And we observe even wicked people seem to have it better than good, honest people. And it doesn't make sense. And oh, I thought if I just followed God, it would go my way. I thought if I just did what was right, then things would always go well for me. Okay, now there is some elements of truth in that, right? That wisdom teaches, hey, if you do wise things, it's typically going to go well, right? If you're nice to people, they'll probably like you, generally speaking, right? If you're honest in business, be able to have a good business for the most part. Okay, but these are not guarantees. They're not guarantees and stuff. I just want to spend a little bit of time reading Romans 13 because this is kind of a New Testament flavor on this section. And so I'm just gonna click into here and get us to this section, and just kind of see what the New Testament authors write about this, right? Uh, Chapter 13. Here's what it says: "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Right? This is kind of sound a little bit familiar. We're not sure if Paul, who wrote Romans, had Ecclesiastes 8 in mind, but it kind of has some similarities, doesn't it? "Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. Pray to all, Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." And so we kind of get this picture, but I love this kind of next section of here, right? This next kind of train of thought, right? Because it's kind of saying of like, hey, give to whoever you owe, give it to them. Okay. But then it says, "Oh, no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law." And this is what it looks like to live it out. This is how we flesh out this section, and really even conclude this picture of wisdom that we see in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, right? Because he said, hey, just live life, do these things. And I think you could take this idea is we do that in an environment, an atmosphere of love. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law, right? If we want to say, like, what does it look like to fear God? Um, how they're talking about it in Ecclesiastes, I think the New Testament authors would say, well, what it looks like though, if we really fear God, is to love others, right? This is the way of Jesus. And here's one thing for those who are really frustrated with government and all that kind of stuff: keep your gaze on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith. Don't don't be um discouraged by all the stuff around you, because it's really easy to get discouraged by politics. It's easy to be discouraged by the stuff going on in the world, the injustice and stuff. But instead, we need to take the cue of Jesus and be filled by his love so that we can love others. Look at verse 9. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any of the commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. And I just love it how it just kind of it just sums it all up, right? Sum it all up. What does it look like? This is that part of the arrow that should penetrate our heart and be like, okay, yeah, I can see and I can be upset about the injustices. I can see and be upset about how things are going with governments. But am I a person who lives in relationship with Jesus? And because of that relationship with Jesus, because Jesus, greater love has none than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. This is what Jesus did for us. And he gives us this model, this way of life connected to him, and we can live it out through Jesus. And we can live this way of love. And that's something that cannot be controlled by a government. That's something that no law can implement, right? Because if you really want to speed, you can speed. Okay, you might get in trouble for doing it, but you can do it if you want. Okay, but the way of love, right? That's something that's transcendent. That's something that's powerful. This is why in the Bible it says God is love, right? You read First John, and it just goes on and on about what this love looks like. And we need to live out the way of Jesus and the way of love. And it's a challenging thing in a challenging time, but it's something that God calls us into. It's this invitation we have. And wisdom, I think, will look like love. Wisdom will flesh itself out in this. And that's what we can really grasp. That's what we can really do. And so don't be discouraged in this time. Instead, figure out, how can I love more? How can I increase my love? And it only happens through a connection with Jesus. It only happens when we're so convinced of the good news and the gospel of Jesus takes root in our heart, and it changes us and transforms us to be people of love. Continue to spend time looking at God's word. Continue to spend time meditating on it. Continue to spend time saying, God, how can I walk this faith with you out? How can I walk in wisdom, but knowing its limitations, but also saying, what does it look like? And that's where Jesus is so awesome, because he's just this incredible picture of what it looks like to really, really be human.